Hello friends, welcome back to the Mothership. Today we're going to smoke up our very own beef short plate ribs. Let's get started. What we have here is a set of beef short ribs. These are USDA Prime, and the first thing we want to do obviously is take them out of the packaging. I always cut these from the bone side. Now when you're doing beef short ribs, there's a couple of different things that people have different preferences about. One of which is the fat cap. The question is, do you want to remove the fat cap? Do you want to trim it down? Do you want to keep it completely? And I think honestly that really depends on the cut of meat. These are prime and you can see there's a decent amount of intramuscular fat in there. And I want a good bark on here, so I'm actually going to remove as much of this as I can. Now just like all trimmings, it is so much easier to do this when they are just out of sitting in the fridge and they are nice and cold. Because the warmer this fat gets, the more it wants to smear and it becomes a huge pain in the butt to get off. Now that looks pretty good to me. The most important thing is I got off the silver skin, I got off the cap over here. There's still some hard fat right up in here, but this is basically on the bone. And if I cut out too much of that, it's going to make too many divots, which I don't want to make because I don't want too much pooling. This is the bone right here, so I'm not too worried about that either. All in all, this is a really nice cut of meat. Look at this marbling. Could be delicious. So if we flip it over, here's another one of those decision points. Now, just like with pork ribs, a lot of people take off a membrane. I have noticed that in reality, you don't need to take the membrane off really for beef ribs. The only thing you're going to get with taking the membrane out is they might cook a little bit faster. And when you are actually going to eat them, they'll fall apart and they'll come right off the bones very easily. I don't really need that, and I don't think it's very necessary. In general, I don't ever take them off. At some point, maybe I'll experiment with taking the membrane off, but for beef ribs, I'm going to leave it on. You could also score it. You could do like a check mark pattern. That works too. But in reality, it's not necessary. So we've come to the point where it's time to salt. Now, as always, big cuts of meat. I salt my meat first, put it in the fridge, let the meat sweat in all that salt, and then I go ahead with the rest of my rub. So a lot like pork ribs, which is kind of a pain, I can't really use my ratio. My ratio is for a cut of meat is in general about a teaspoon per pound. And these were 5 pounds before I started to trim, which would mean that I would need about 2.5 teaspoons of salt. But there's a whole lot of bone in here, so I don't really need to put nearly as much salt as I would if I was doing that calculation. So basically, I'm just going to cover it down. That looks good. I still have some left. This is actually measuring out 2.5, which would have been the 1/2 teaspoon per pound. I think that's enough salt. You don't really have to do anything on this side because obviously this is the membrane like we talked about. So I'm gonna let the salt sit. And maybe at some point I will do a beginner series on beef ribs like I've done with brisket and pork ribs. But in general, just so you know, I do the salt because I want a good bark. And all this salt, if I start to put pepper and garlic powder on here, that salt might just fall off. And then everything that's on top of it might fall off too. My best bet to get the best bark is to let the salt get into the meat, not have to worry about it, and then I'll have more surface area of the meat exposed for my black pepper and my garlic to adhere to. Our salt has sweated perfectly into our meat, and now it is time to give it the rest of our rub. I'm going to go pretty traditional with this one, and we're just going to do black pepper and garlic. I usually do a mix of granulated garlic powder and minced garlic powder. So I'm going to give it a quick coating of garlic powder, and then a little bit of the minced. Since we added in our salt in the first step, you can really go crazy and put as much on here as you want. It's not going to be overly salty. Obviously, it could be too much garlic or too much pepper, but at least it won't be too salty. Because we have a membrane on the back here, we don't really have to worry about doing anything on this side. You can if you want to, but it's really not necessary. But obviously, doing your sides is necessary. A lot of surface area on this, so it's worth it to spend the time and make sure you get the sides as well. Now, as you can see, I did not go on here with a binder. I didn't really think it was necessary, and everything is sticking just fine. Was not necessary. But what you could have done is anything from water to mustard to olive oil. But because we had it sitting in the fridge, letting the salt absorb into the meat, there was a little bit of moisture on the exterior of the meat, and that's what I used as my binder, essentially. Now, this is going to go back in the fridge until tomorrow when we actually get it onto the smoker. It is the morning, and our smoker is up to temp. I've placed our beef ribs on the smoker, as you can see. I'm gonna cook them here at about 180 degrees for a couple hours. Then I'm gonna bump the temp up to about 225. And then what's gonna happen is I'm gonna start watching for it to dry out a little bit. If I see a little bit of dryness, I'm gonna spritz. And then we're just gonna keep going at 225 until we hit that old Texas crutch, where we're gonna have to put it into some peach paper, wrap it, tallow, and go all the way until it's finished, somewhere around 195, but mostly when it probes tender. Let's just let it do its thing for a while, and we'll come back when it's time to do some spritzing. We are approximately 3 hours into the cook, and at this point I'm gonna start doing two things. Number one, I'm going to begin spritzing. This is a 50-50 mix of hard apple cider and light beer. I'm also going to bump my temperature up to 225 degrees. And then we're going to keep monitoring going forward to make sure that nothing dries out and keep spritzing when needed. You can see there's a little bit of pullback coming on. They're starting to look nice. If you are curious about internal temperature at this point, we are probing with the instant at 160 degrees. We are about 6 hours into this cook, and my bark is pretty much set. There's a bunch of pullback over here, which is unfortunate, just for appearance, but these are looking pretty good to me. Some nice pullback on the ribs on the sides. So it's time to wrap it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place it down with the meat side towards my tallow. I'm actually going to turn it like so. Then we're going to wrap it, making sure we remember which side is the meat side of our ribs. There we go. That looks good to me. This is going to go back onto the smoker, and I'm going to bump the temperature up to 250 degrees. Now we're looking for that probe tender point, so we're going to let the meat keep doing its thing, and we're looking for in between the ribs to go in nice and tender like you would do a brisket. It has been a little over 8 hours since our brisket on a stick went onto the smoker, and now it is officially pulled. Everything was probing nice and tender. If you're interested about temperatures, my internal was reading somewhere between mid 190s and 200 degrees. All across the ribs. So if you're wondering what I did, I took the ribs out, kept them inside the paper, wrapped them inside of a towel, and then put them into a rotomold cooler. This cooler I pre-warmed by you just putting some hot water into it and leaving it in there till the entire thing got nice and toasty. Poured out the water, wiped it dry, then dropped in our little toweled up package. Then I stuffed the rest of the cooler with towels just to make sure that all the surface area in there was taken covered with towels. And honestly, just like I do with brisket, I'm gonna leave it until I'm ready to eat it. At this point, that's probably about 2.5 hours, maybe 3, and it should be fine in there. It's honestly good for a longer rest. It's time to eat these suckers, so let's see what we're working with here. Oh man, that looks pretty good to me. Yep, that looks incredible to me. Just pulls right off the bone. Nice smoke ring, obviously very juicy. Can't complain about that at all. Now, as you can see, there's no way you're keeping the bone on these suckers. I had actually hoped that the bone was gonna stay a little bit more connected, just for the shot, more than anything else. But I have to say, they're looking absolutely incredible. There is a really nice smoke ring on these, you can see in there. And they are calling me to give it the chomp, guys. Let's go. If brisket is the king of barbecue, then the ribs are like a kick-ass Duke or something, because they are absolutely incredible. These are basically just brisket on a stick. I know these aren't the cheapest cut you can get out there, and obviously you can get beef back ribs or baby back ribs or pork spare ribs for a much cheaper cost. But if you can find beef plate ribs that have a decent amount of marbling on them, something like a prime, I'm telling you, it's going to be absolutely incredible. The salt, pepper, and garlic really comes together as just a very simple rub. And since it's the same way I do my briskets, it is the way that I like to do my ribs as well. These are super good. I'm really excited to just eat the rest of these. And it's one of those cooks where as you're doing it, the smell and just knowing what you're about to eat, you just can't wait for it to be finished. Honestly, some people only do about a half an hour rest on these. Ours is about 2 hours. And it's definitely worth it. They only get better with time. If you're looking for your bones to stay in your ribs, I would recommend not wrapping them. They'll be a little bit drier on the exterior because when you put them in the wrap like that, they actually soften up the exterior a bit because you kind of have like a steam environment. So if you want to have the bones in there for presentation, I would recommend not wrapping. But as far as the quality of the meat, Our bark has already set, as you can see, and it just softened up the meat even more and lowered the cooking time by putting it into our wrap. Adding in some beef tallow is always going to make your food good also. Honestly, guys, this is a great cook. You know it's going to be a great cook. I knew it was going to be a great cook. It's one of my favorite meals. You guys should absolutely give it a try. You guys should tell me how you do your beef ribs differently, if at all. And always let me know what you're cooking down below. I'd love to hear from you. So, YouTube jazz, like, comment, subscription, all that stuff. And most importantly, cook something fantastic, guys. Take it easy.